Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I'm Jeff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure, that you can catch each Wednesday at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. We finish up our trek through the Next Generation episodes featuring the Borg this week with another season finale / season premiere 2-part episode. Now, I think it's important to understand a few things about Star Trek The Next Generation and how television shows were written 30 years ago compared to today. I think I've done a good job in earlier episodes of this series explaining some of this, but I think it's worth a little bit of reiteration. Star Trek The Next Generation was not exactly the pop culture sci-fi juggernaut people think of it as today when it began in 1987. The series struggled mightily to find its footing until the third season, and when that third season ended with the dramatic cliffhanger at the end of The Best of Both Worlds Part 1, The Next Generation had fully and finally arrived to live up to the greatness those who stuck through the first 74 episodes hoped it could achieve. Now, with that as a launching point, seasons 4 and 5 would continue strengthening the series and the characters by fleshing each individual character out into a fully realized three-dimensional person, the likes of which the original Trek series didn't really achieve outside of Kirk, Spock, and McCoy. Each of these characters had a distinct set of characteristics and values that they rarely strayed from without a great deal of drama and consideration. While seasons 6 and 7 would pretty much go down as being not quite as good as the middle 3 seasons, they still made for great Star Trek. And one of the things about the era of television and how the Next Generation would capitalize on what made it so damn good was the episodic nature of the series itself, while still connecting dots between other episodes. It was possible to have Q, who introduced the Borg for more than a year to pass before the follow-up could take place in The Best of Both Worlds, but still make it feel like the series was originally building toward that big confrontation with the Borg Collective and not require people to watch every episode in between. Then Borg and this week's episode of that we're going to be looking at, Descent, would launch off the previous, but also work as its own little story and sequel as well. All the while, it's keeping the character development and loose connecting thread thanks to a room of writers all working together, bouncing ideas off of each other, and getting inspired by the work of the whole of that group. So when we get to this story, again, Descent, parts 1 and 2, we're still in the great Star Trek era. But this episode kind of retroactively sort of considered a misstep that would kind of have rippling effects for a little while to come. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. What is important to catch you up on is the story of Lieutenant Commander Data, played by Brent Spiner. Now, Data was, for all intents and purposes, the Spock of the Next Generation series. He was the second officer, third in line to command the Enterprise behind Riker and Captain Picard. And he was the character who spent the entirety of the series basically learning how to be a human. Early on in the series, way back in the first season, in fact, we learned more about the man who built him and how he had built another earlier version of what Data is. And that brother of sorts to Data was called Lore. Now, Lore was a little too human, where Data was lacking many of the qualities Lore had. And that made Lore more vindictive, greedy, and flat out evil. He even had a facial tic. Spiner played both Lore and Data, and while not the most original of concepts, seeing Spiner play both good and evil was always fun whenever it would come up and whenever we would see these episodes in reruns. But let's get into Descent, shall we? Like with the Best of Both Worlds, we see a poker game at the beginning, but instead of it being the primary cast of officers, it's Data playing poker against Isaac Newton, Albert Einstein, and Stephen Hawking, who is there playing himself. Data explains he likes playing poker to get insights on how humans think and how they react to certain scenarios. And that, really helps inform that Data really is still trying to figure out how to be more human. He's always had the Pinocchio syndrome. Now, Data is in the holodeck, the entertainment space on the Enterprise that can create holographic environments. There were many, many episodes in which the holodeck would have some sort of malfunction or something, and it would be deadly to be in the holodeck or whatever. But his game is interrupted with a red alert distress call from an outpost. There is an unrecognizable ship orbiting the planet. Data, Worf, Riker, and another security guard beam down to take a look. The wounds on the officers found dead look like it came from a Ferengi weapon, but Riker says that doesn't seem right. It's too brutal for this particular attack for it to be the Ferengi. Nothing seems missing, but when Data opens a jammed door, he discovers a Borg drone. This reveals several more drones who seem different. They move faster. They aren't emotionless. They refer to themselves in the first person I, as opposed to the first person plural of we. They're also interested in combat, not assimilation. They were there to kill those people. Not take the computers and the data that was there at that installation. Now, curiously, when in hand-to-hand combat with one of the supposed drones, Data becomes enraged, and while doing so, he viciously breaks the neck of the drone he is fighting. Back on board the ship, Data alerts Picard of the peculiar and unexpected burst of emotion he felt on the planet, and he excuses himself from the debriefing and goes to get checked out by Geordi, to whom he says he must have experienced his first ever actual emotion. Worryingly, though, Data felt pleasure after killing the Borg drone he throttled. Meanwhile, Riker delivers the report that these Borg were more like fighting Klingons than what they've seen from the Borg before, and they refer to themselves as I and each other with names. And Picard realizes there has to be some sort of change in their directives, and they need to figure out what's going on with the Borg, and should they prepare for an invasion. So Picard does call in the cavalry, and Admiral Nechayev is dispatched to lead a whole group of starships in preparation for a Borg invasion. He is reprimanded for not destroying Hugh or go forward with his original plan of having an invasive viral program sent back with Hugh to destroy the Borg as a species. And she makes a very clear command. If given another opportunity to completely and totally wipe out the Borg species, he is to take that opportunity and do it. There is no other thoughts to be had. There has to be, they have to wipe out the Borg completely. The Enterprise finds the Borg ship that attacked the outpost and attempt to capture the ship, but the ship slips away through some sort of subspace conduit the Borg ship is using to travel around large distances in almost an instant. The Enterprise is pulled into the conduit as well and engage the Borg, including killing 2 drones who beamed aboard the bridge. Now, them beaming aboard the bridge was a distraction to allow their ship to leave. Another unexpected behavior of the Borg. They didn't collect their dead. They actually sacrificed them to be able to get away. Now, one of the intruding Borg drones is injured and captured, and the Borg drone says he does not have a designation. Instead, he has a name, Croesus. This name was given to him by the quote-unquote one who leads them. Picard leaves Data with the prisoner to find out if he's sending a subspace message to the collective, and the drone activates something on his arm as he talks to Data about emotions. This affects Data, and during the conversation, the Borg offers something very tempting to Data, the ability to feel emotions again, even if it means killing his best friend to obtain those feelings again. And Data, he likes that idea. Data and Croesus escape the ship through hijacking a shuttlecraft, and they take off through one of those subspace conduits. The Enterprise follows and find a planet that has a lot of interference in the atmosphere that prevents them from scanning the surface effectively. So Riker, Worf, and security detail find the shuttle, beam down and find the shuttle empty, and it's been powered down for, about the last 3 hours or so. Now, Picard agrees to actually go down to the surface as part of several groups of crew members acting as both a search force, but also potentially an attack force, leaving the Enterprise under the command of Dr. Crusher, who, with orders to basically not wait for any of the away teams to get back before hightailing it out of there if the Borg ship shows back up and attacks the Enterprise. On the surface, Picard, Troy, Geordi, and a security officer discover a structure, and upon entering that structure, they discover almost fascistic flags and symbols. And they are soon surrounded by shouting, rambunctious Borg who kill the security officer. But before they kill the other three, they are confronted by Data's evil brother, Lore. And it's soon revealed that Data has joined with Lore, and they plan on destroying the Federation. Now, Picard accuses Lore of controlling Data and corrupting the Borg. Now, Hugh's individuality from the I, Borg episode did in fact infect the Borg ship that he was beamed back to. The newfound individuality disorientated the cube and made them almost incapable of functioning properly. Lore helped them form a society, and as he put it, gave them purpose, and in return they gave him what he saw as his purpose, the ability to rule, which would include eventually assimilating the worthy and destroying the outdated and obsolete. Meanwhile, on the Enterprise, Crusher is left with a bunch of ensigns and midshipmen. The Borg ship is closing in, so she beams up as many people as she could and takes off and hightails it out of there with 47 crew members still on the planet. Riker and Worf go looking for Picard while telling those who were left behind to gather up and hide and avoid any contact with the Borg. Crusher and a bunch of young officers are trying to figure out ways to save as many of those away team members as possible without being detected or having to be destroyed by the Borg ship that's constantly kind of threatening. Geordi, Troy, and Picard are thrown into a brig, and Lore tells Data that he wants to experiment on Geordi. Geordi also believes that Lore wanted Data to take his visor because he could see the carrier wave that is surrounding Data. Somehow, Lore has deactivated Data's ethical subroutines and is beaming negative emotions to him. They have to figure out a way to emit a pulse that will basically break that link and basically reboot Data's ethical programming. Elsewhere, Riker and Worf discover a literal underground group of Borg who want to fight against Lore. There, they find Hugh, and Hugh is pissed. He is not happy to see anybody from the Enterprise. Hugh's individuality created chaos and confusion and death. Hugh reveals that when Lore came along, he wanted to basically subjugate the Borg into and also make them into subjects of experiments, which Lore claims would give the Borg total robotics forms and minds as opposed to being cybernetic. And when he shows Riker and Worf what those experiments do to the Borg drones, you see them that they're basically broken and left brain damaged. And Hugh asks about his only friend, Geordi, to which Riker and Worf say he's been captured. So everybody begins to kind of form a rescue plan. With guidance from Geordi, Picard builds the device that will more or less reboot Data's ethical programming, while Crusher's ragtag team of kids figure out a way to use the system Star to destroy the Borg ship. Back on the planet, Lore commands Data to kill Picard, but Data refuses. Lore then plans to make an example of Data by killing him, but Hugh intervenes, allowing his group of rebels with Riker and Worf in tow to storm in and save Picard, Troy, and Geordi. Data confronts Lore and deactivates his brother. Picard and crew leave the planet believing that Hugh will now lead this group of Borg in the hopes that they understand how to both think individually but also work together as a community. So let's talk about the 3 things I like about Descent. First, I like how they portray Dr. Crusher as being in command of the Enterprise. Before I dive into this, understand that every member of the cast has something to do in this episode. Picard is trying to reach through Lore's manipulation of Data. Riker and Worf are the hero men of the story. They're doing the action stuff. Geordi is Data's friend and emotional anchor. He also happens to be Hugh's only friend. He's the one who's able to kind of buy a little time with Data as his ethics are starting to reboot. And he also is the reason why Hugh, despite being as angry as he is at the Enterprise crew, he's the reason why Hugh decides he should help the crew in trying to take down Lore. Troy is reading what emotions she can from Data's sudden outburst of emotion, and Crusher is on the bridge commanding the Enterprise. Now, she's not there to fight off the always circling and threatening Borg ship. Her orders are to run away from a fight. However, she is dedicated to the safety of the crew, as a good doctor should be. She wants as many people as she can beamed up from the planet, and so her entire plot of the second half of the story is how to inspire trust and quality teamwork from a bunch of noobs who don't know how to do starship things the same as the usual crew would. But what is she doing? She's doing doctor things. She's protecting. She's avoiding harm. She's sheltering crew members. It's fantastic and a super smart way to play the episode's plot from the ship's perspective, since most of the heavy lifting is going to be planet side when it comes to the plot. So when Crusher takes a risk, it's entirely about beaming up more crew members to safety. It's to save, not to outsmart or destroy the Borg ship that's hunting them. Now, they do figure out a way to outsmart and destroy the Borg ship that's hunting them, but that's not the primary goal of what she's supposed to be doing as the temporary commander of the Enterprise. It's great. It's a real tip of the cap to how well the Next Generation writing crew knew their characters and made sure to give them things to do that fit their characters. Next, I always like a terrestrial setting for the majority of any Star Trek episode. If you're on a planet, yes, of course, there are going to be times you're going to be up on the ship or whatever. But if you're mostly on a planet during a Star Trek episode, I'm always looking and watching and seeing what the landscape is. I'm not sure what it is about this little patch of rural Southern California that gives me a pleasant feeling to watching an episode of Star Trek, but this time around, there's a little extra to like about it. There's this fairly lush color palette used for this episode that's enhanced by adding a little bit of I think it's an orange or red tint to the visuals. The tint is put into the location filming so to give that representation of that static field that surrounds the planet and gives the problems for scanning and so forth. But then you have these trees and grass, and what's actually there on this planet? Well, it's the Borg and Lore, inhuman, kind of lifeless looking things. But I love that building that is used for the location of Lore's base with his Borg. That's the Brandeis Barden campus, which is a real place associated with the American Jewish University that you can, right now, call up and host events at and visit. It was also used as Camp Khitomer in Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country, where the big peace talks between the Federation and the Klingon Empire take place. I just love how un-Borg-like the building really is, too. It's this more artistic, curving design than as opposed to the stark cube-shaped stuff that the Borg we saw in the past have. There's just a neat location at play here in this episode that is nicely juxtaposed to those more mechanical villains that are being used to drive the plot. And finally, I like how this episode is distinctly placed in the history of the Next Generation series and where it goes. Lore was one of the early bad guys. His first appearance was way back in season 1. His final appearance was at the very beginning of the 7th and final season. It's a nice closing of the books on the characters, particularly of Lore. But then 30 years later, Lore would pop back up in the final season of Picard. The Borg, on the other hand, it wasn't super obvious they would be seen again. I mean, was the entire collective poisoned by Hugh's individuality, or was it just that one cube? It wasn't entirely explained. Now, of course, we knew, and we can also look at it in retrospect, that this crew was going to end up on the big screen. And it was going to happen very soon after the series ended. And of course, even back then, we knew the Borg felt like this perfect big bad for a movie. The best of both worlds proved that they were worthy of this. But if this was going to be the end of the Borg, it's actually kind of a good arc. Now, I'll explain a little bit more about what ends up happening with the Borg in just a moment. But this is the last time we ever saw the original version of the Borg too, which is that George Romero style zombie-like creatures wearing the black outfits with the hoses and stuff that stick out of their skin. And, that holds a lot of questions on whether or not the way that the Borg are designed, starting with Star Trek First Contact, the second film that featured the Next Generation crew, and how they were redesigned for that, and how that redesign would later be used quite a bit in Voyager. But this was the last time we saw this version of the Borg, and there's a lot of question whether or not this was a different Borg than what we would see later. But I kind of don't really buy into this as a different version of the Borg as opposed to the later versions, the better makeup version ones. But this is kind of a nice send-off for the more, the idea that, hey, these are actually Next Generation specific villains. They're not going to be seen in Deep Space Nine. I mean, the origins of Deep Space Nine do involve the Borg in terms of the commander on board that station and his relationship with Picard and with Starfleet and all of that. But I do kind of like that this is a very nice, okay, this is the end of this version of the Borg. It's kind of a interesting arc that they go on. And, it ties stuff up nicely with Lore, figures out what happened to Hugh and the collective after Borg, and gives everyone something important to do in the story. And I'm not sure you could ask for much more of an episode of a long-running series full of characters that we really, really like. And because of that, it really kind of sets a nice stage for the final season of Star Trek The Next Generation. But let's talk now about what happened from here. As for this journey across these 4 stories that are comprised within 6 individual episodes of Star Trek Next Generation, we pretty much see the entirety, like I said, of the Borg story. And some people believe that what we really saw was the rise and fall of the Borg. Now, I mentioned just now that the series revisited ideas and places from earlier in the series, and the character development was very key because it informed the characters, and we could see how these distinct people would react to scenarios presented by whatever adventure they were on that week. And because of all of that, and because even though this was episodic in nature, you had the ability to still grow characters while also referencing previous episodes. You could still have Q-Who that would set things in motion that would lead to the best of both worlds. For that to have some character beats that would play into the Borg episode, which would then lead directly into Descent. But you would still have all the episodes in between still doing a lot of heavy work to give characters new insights as they continued on in between those connected episodes. However, Q-Who introduced this new villain that was unlike anything else seen up to that point, and the best of both worlds made their threat not only real, but also enhanced it to give them more depth, that their goal wasn't just destruction of the Federation, like so many other baddies we've seen, like the Klingons or the Romulans, but the actual assimilation of the Federation, stripping all individuals of their free will and identities. Borg figured out a way to make the Borg almost sympathetic. Well, at least when it comes to Hugh. But it also forced characters like Picard and Guinan to gaze upon their own prejudices about the Borg and how they should treat opposing life forms with respect and dignity. That was the lesson of the episode. This is a fantastic trilogy of sorts for that character growth. Now, kind of retrospectively, the reason why Descent is kind of looked at as a slight misstep, at least for some people, I find this episode to be actually kind of fun, and a lot of other people do, even if it doesn't have quite the same impact as the other Borg episodes. But some people believe that these Borg, now separated from the Hive, are just another group of mustache-twirling villains of the week, more than the clear and present danger of our increasing reliance on technology to solve what ails us. And because of that, a lot of people do say that starting with this episode, the Borg start to kind of lose what makes them interesting. They aren't much more than a bunch of generic alien forces that are in this episode are under the sway of the main villain of the episode, another mustache twirling villain in lore. Now, this was kind of the problem that would arise with the Borg going forward from here. I mean, of course, they bounce back in a big, big way in Star Trek First Contact that reestablished and redesigned them to go back to their original terrifying design and characteristics. But they even had a way of basically instantly assimilating someone, making and even being near them a scary notion and make them a bigger threat. However, Descent proved to be the first sign that people were kind of making sure ratings remained solid, they were willing to utilize the Borg probably a little bit too much and too often in potentially inappropriate ways that diminish their effectiveness. Still, we will always have the best of both worlds. So I personally find Descent to be as a fun episode with a fun villain. Lore is always fun. The Borg, you do find out that yes, individuality can corrupt them. And there's a lot of character stuff within the crew of the Enterprise to like. But I also understand where a lot of people point to this episode and say, this is kind of where the Borg are now just another monster of the week, as opposed to something more interesting, something more dangerous, something scarier. Now, the series would come to a conclusion at the end of this 7th season that Descent kicks off with a feature-length episode that wonderfully tied 7 years worth of storytelling and character building together in a nice bow. And then the TNG crew was off to the movie theaters for 4 film appearances. Now, while the movies were kind of hit and miss, the 178 episodes that made up Star Trek The Next Generation is the purest essence of what these characters were, the troubles they faced, and the way that every single member of the crew had the opportunity to be involved in a solution. And that's what made the series so special, and eventually what all other Trek since must be compared to. And for that, it's kind of nice to actually have a reason to talk about them here. I doubt that I'm going to go back to any Star Trek series, but I was glad to finally talk about the Borg. I was glad to finally kind of revisit these 4 pretty pivotal stories when it comes to the success of The Next Generation, and be able to kind of share some of my own thoughts about them as well. But that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday at filmseizure.com. Don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Threads, Instagram, and Blue Sky. You can also subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure Podcast and Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers, as well as YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieenema.com, to read new reviews every Friday morning. And if you do want to hear more about Star Trek First Contact, we did an episode of that for Film Seizure back a few years ago. Just search on our site for that, and we talk a little bit about where the Borg ended up going from here. So I definitely recommend you do that. Next time, we enter the late summer and early fall as the countdown to the 300th episode of Monster Mondays officially begins. But first, we have to come face to face with the Lovecraftian horror that is The Void. Until next week, stay spooky.